He spent the whole hearing tearing Karoline Leavitt down, mocking her, questioning her character, trying to break her in front of a crowd. But before he could finish, federal agents walked in and put him in handcuffs. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of a black Ford Explorer onto the slushy curb of Chestnut Street in Manchester, New Hampshire. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. Cameras were already rolling. Local news vans lined the sidewalk like vultures waiting on a headline. She wasn't new to pressure, but this morning something felt off. This was supposed to be minor, a complaint tied to a speech she gave last fall at a veterans fundraiser. One sentence taken out of context, her lawyers argued, was being twisted into a supposed violation of state campaign ethics law. She'd spoken without a script, candidly. As always, someone had filed an official complaint, and the court took it seriously enough to assign a hearing, but no one in her camp thought it would amount to anything. Karoline adjusted her navy coat and pushed through the glass doors of the courthouse, flanked by her attorney, Alan Dorsey. Alan was calm, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice even when provoked. They had reviewed everything. The paperwork was clean, the timeline solid. They were confident. But as they walked into courtroom 4B, it was clear this wouldn't be the clean procedural morning they expected. Judge Ronald Marks entered 5 minutes late, his robe half buttoned, in a worn leather notebook under his arm. He didn't acknowledge the room, just sat, adjusted his microphone, flipped through a few papers. Karoline had seen him before on television, mostly a former federal prosecutor turned Superior Court judge with a reputation for being blunt and unfiltered. He had a strange kind of celebrity status in certain circles, mainly progressive legal forums, and a few national cable segments. Some people saw him as a bold voice against corruption. Others whispered about the way he handled cases that involved political figures, especially conservatives. That morning, she realized which version of him had shown up. "Let's move this along," he said, eyes still on the file. Miss Leavitt stepped forward. "She did what we're reviewing today," he continued, "isn't just a matter of paperwork, it's a matter of judgment. Yours. Frankly, I'm struggling to see why you thought what you said in front of a group of veterans was remotely appropriate." Karoline didn't answer. Her attorney started to object, but Marks held up his hand, silencing him with a single glance. "Is this about ethics?" Marks asked aloud, but clearly not to anyone in particular. "Or is it about how far some people are willing to go to stay in the public eye, even if that means poisoning civic discourse?" A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. The stenographer hesitated, then kept typing. Alan leaned over to whisper something, but Karoline stayed still. She could feel it. This wasn't about that speech. This was personal. Marks went on, raising his voice just enough to ensure the media caught it. "Your generation thinks that politics is performance, that speaking loudly means speaking truth. I'm not impressed by that. And I'm even less impressed by your sudden rise to fame." The courtroom had become a theater. There was no rhythm, no legal framework being followed, just one man on a mission. Karoline finally spoke. "Your Honor, are we discussing the complaint, or are you giving a public review of my career?" Mark smirked, leaning back, while Ms. Leavitt, "Sometimes the two are the same thing." The room was quiet for a few seconds. Alan stood and requested a formal motion to redirect the hearing to its original scope. Marks ignored him. This wasn't a courtroom anymore, it was something else. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get more off track, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The creaking door barely registered at first. Everyone's eyes were still locked on the bench, on Judge Marks, still in full control. A court officer slipped in and quietly closed the door behind him, taking position near the back. No one paid much attention at the front. Karoline stood firm. Judge Marks tapped his pen against the wood, slow and rhythmic. "Let's talk about character," he said. "That seems to be the word people use when they describe you. Strong character, bold voice, a fighter, I think one of your supporters said in an op-ed. But what I want to know, Miss Leavitt, is this: where was that bold character when you accused elected officials of selling out our country during a campaign fundraiser? Did you think no one would notice, or did you think your youth gave you a pass?" Alan leaned forward, his voice louder this time. "Your Honor, respectfully, that's a distorted interpretation of her statement. The full context, I've read the transcript." Mark snapped several times. "And frankly, if you think a statement like that doesn't carry implications, maybe you shouldn't be representing anyone." The room tensed. Karoline's cheeks flushed, but she didn't move. "I stand by what I said. I was speaking to veterans, men and women," who have actually sacrificed for this country. My words were blunt, because the truth often is. Marks chuckled. The truth, huh? Or was it fundraising? Big gasp broke out in the gallery. A few phones were quietly lifted, trying to capture the moment. Despite the no recording policy, a reporter scribbled something furiously in her notepad. This wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about a judge using a seat to make a spectacle, and everyone could feel it. Allen stepped forward. Again, Your Honor, I'm filing a motion to postpone this hearing on grounds of judicial bias. Marks waved his hand, as if swatting a fly. Denied. You don't get to cry bias because someone challenges your client's fairy tale. Karoline blinked once, then again, but her hands stayed at her sides. She knew what this was, not just an attempt to embarrass her, but to reduce her publicly, to paint her as nothing more than a loudmouth who stumbled into politics and didn't belong. She looked at the cameras. They were still rolling. Marks leaned in. You want to be taken seriously, then act like someone with the maturity to handle criticism, not a pundit with a microphone and a chip on her shoulder. Her voice was lower this time, but every word hit the room like a drumbeat. Do you treat every young woman who speaks her mind this way, or just the ones who disagree with your politics? The judge stopped for a brief moment. His eyes narrowed, not in thought but in calculation. It was as if he hadn't expected pushback, not from her. I treat people based on what they say and how they act, he replied. You built your image on confrontation. Don't act surprised when you find yourself confronted. The courtroom doors opened again. This time louder. A uniformed man entered, followed by another in a gray jacket. Both headed quietly toward the sidewalk. They didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just stood there watching. Marks noticed them, but kept talking. Let me be clear, this isn't about silencing you. This is about reminding you and others watching that words have consequences. You can't say whatever you want without expecting pushback. Karoline tilted her head. So this hearing is about sending a message. It's about accountability, you mean? Intimidation. Mark stared at her. He didn't respond, not with words, just a thin smile, as he looked back down at the papers in front of him. But the quiet presence of the men in the back started to shift the air in the room. Yeah, I'm sorry if you knew, because while Judge Marks thought he was the one making an example of Karoline, he had no idea what was coming next. While the judge continued his power trip at the bench, a very different scene was taking shape behind the courtroom's polished walls. Downstairs, in a windowless administrative corridor, two federal agents stood with clipped ID badges and a sealed manila folder. Their jackets bore no insignia, but their presence was unmistakable to anyone who looked closely enough. One of them, Agent Keating, checked his watch. They told us to wait for the signal. The other, a woman named Laura Hendricks, nodded without looking up. She was focused on the folder in her hands. Inside it, nearly a year's worth of sealed affidavits, subpoenaed communications, and testimonies from former staff inside Judge Ronald Marks's chambers. Allegations of misconduct, kickbacks, and systematic abuse of his position weren't new, but up until this morning no one had dared to act on them publicly. No one, until one whistleblower cracked. That whistleblower was sitting quietly just 3 doors down in a witness waiting room. Jillian Vargas had been Marks's judicial assistant for 2 years. She wasn't political. She didn't care about headlines or ideology. She cared about doing her job and about the strange things. She began to notice meetings that happened at odd hours, files that disappeared before hearings, long calls from private numbers after court adjourned. When she discovered that Marks had accepted thousands of dollars in campaign contributions routed through fake legal firms, then dismissed a related case involving one of those very donors, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Still, blowing the whistle hadn't been easy. Her first complaint went nowhere. The second one vanished altogether. Only when she went straight to a contact at the Department of Justice, off the record, did things begin to move slowly, quietly, patiently. Until now, upstairs, Judge Marks was growing bolder by the minute, blind to the fact that the very courtroom he used as his personal stage was being watched by the agents in the back, by Jillian on a screen nearby, and by a quiet team in an unmarked vehicle across the street, recording every word in the hallway. Laura's earpiece buzzed. It's time. She turned to Keating. Let's go back inside the courtroom. Karoline hadn't moved, but her expression had shifted. What had started as discomfort had turned into a sort of detached awareness. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was watching. Mark stood now, pacing slightly. There's a trend I've noticed. People in your position, they confuse attention with integrity, but saying things that rile up crowds doesn't make you right, it just makes you loud. Alan tried once again. Your Honor, this is improper. This is not a platform for your political commentary. If you continue, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to the Judicial Review Board. Marks laughed, a dry, sharp sound. You think they don't already know how I operate? A soft knock echoed from the side door. The bailiff looked up, then opened it slowly. Laura and Keating stepped in with calm precision. No rush, no announcement, just presence. Judge Marks paused mid-sentence, frowning. Excuse me, this is a closed hearing. Keating stepped forward, voice low but steady. Judge Ronald Marks, we have a federal warrant for your arrest. Gasps erupted. A woman in the front row dropped her pen. Another man reached for his phone, caught himself, then froze. Marks looked like someone had slapped him across the face. What is this? He demanded, eyes flicking to the courtroom cameras, the reporters, and finally to Karoline. This is a setup. This is political. Keating didn't flinch. Sir, you are being charged with obstruction of justice, accepting illegal campaign contributions, tampering with court records, and abuse of judicial authority. Please step away from the bench. Alan whispered something to Karoline, but she didn't react. Her eyes were locked on the man who tried to tear her down moments ago. Now he was being handed a document, his own indictment, but before anyone could process what had just happened, Marks grabbed the edge of the bench, steadied himself, and said something that left the entire room stunned. Judge Marks didn't step back. Instead, he leaned forward, knuckles white against the wood of the bench, and stared down at the agents. His voice was lower now, almost growling. This is what they do when someone holds people like her accountable. They find some washed-up assistant with a grudge, dig through your garbage, and call it justice. Keating didn't engage. He opened the warrant folder and began reading aloud word for word, while Laura moved slightly to the side, her eyes scanning the crowd, alert to every reaction. But Marks wasn't finished. You think this is real? He shouted. You think this isn't about politics? She walked into this courtroom with a media team waiting for this exact moment. You're all watching a performance, and she's the lead. He pointed directly at Karoline, and that's when it snapped. Karoline stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking softly against the tile. The entire room went silent. Even the agents paused. I didn't ask for this, she said firmly. I didn't come here hoping to see you dragged away in handcuffs, but I'm not going to apologize for standing up to you either. Mark scoffed. Oh, please spare me the hero monologue. She didn't blink. You tried to humiliate me, not with facts, not with law, with personal attacks disguised as questions, hoping I'd stumble. That doesn't make you powerful, that makes you scared. For a second something flickered in his expression, an almost imperceptible hesitation, not regret, but recognition. She was right, and he knew it. You have no idea what it's like to sit in this chair. He snapped back. You think it's about ego, it's survival. Every week I'm flooded with threats from both sides. Every case I'm expected to choose the right politics before I even hear the facts. Do you think that's justice? Karoline didn't answer. She didn't need to, because that moment wasn't about law, it was about exposure. He had taken off the mask himself from the gallery. Someone whispered, he's admitting it. Judge Mark scanned the crowd, as if realizing just how many people had witnessed his spiral. The camera lenses, the reporters, the murmurs. It all landed on him now. There was no controlling the narrative anymore. Laura stepped closer. Sir, we need you to comply. He stared at her like he didn't hear her, then suddenly turned to the court clerk. Stop typing. The clerk looked paralyzed. No one's going to write this like it happened. Marks muttered, they'll turn it into a movie. I'll be the villain, she'll be the angel. That's how this works now. Alan raised a hand gently. Your Honor, don't make this harder than it needs to be. But Marks just laughed, a low, bitter sound. I gave 30 years to this system. Do you know how many people I protected, how many compromises I had to make just to keep it moving? And how many did you bury along the way? Karoline asked quietly. He looked at her, his mouth open, but nothing came out. Keating stepped forward now, firm. Judge Ronald Marks, place your hands in front of you. This time, he didn't resist. He stood there, robes shifting. As he raised his arms, Laura moved behind him, snapping the cuffs into place. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot as they turned him toward the exit. He locked eyes with Karoline one more time. This is a witch hunt, he muttered. The courtroom buzzed with noise. Some gasped, others muttered, a few clapped. but quickly stopped. Even among those who had wanted to see him fall, there was something haunting about the scene. Karoline exhaled finally, slowly, but even with Marks gone, what came next would test her more than any courtroom ever could. The courtroom emptied slowly, like the air had thickened, and nobody quite knew how to move through it. People lingered, whispering in clumps, unsure whether they'd just witnessed justice or something messy. The judge's bench sat empty now, the chairs still slightly turned from where Marks had stood moments earlier. It looked strange, almost like a throne someone had fled from. Karoline remained standing, her arms folded lightly across her chest. She didn't look triumphant, she looked tired. Alan placed a hand gently on her arm. "We should go, cameras will be waiting, I know," she replied barely above a whisper. They exited through the side hallway, avoiding the main entrance. The court had offered them a private exit, not out of courtesy, but to avoid chaos in the corridor. They passed by Jillian Vargas. Karoline didn't recognize her at first, just a young woman with a scarf wrapped too tightly around her neck and trembling hands gripping a tote bag. Jillian spoke up, "Miss Leavitt." Karoline turned, their eyes met. Jillian's face looked both terrified and determined. "I'm the reason the agents came today," she said. I worked for him. I saw too much. I kept quiet too long." Karoline stepped closer. "You did the right thing. I'm sorry you had to carry that." Jillian shook her head. "You stood there while he came after you. You didn't back down." "I don't think I could have done that." "You already did," Karoline said gently. "You spoke up. That matters more than you know." Jillian smiled, just barely, then she turned and walked away. Outside, the weather had shifted. Clouds hung low, the kind that made the air feel damp, but not yet ready to rain. Reporters clustered behind barriers, cameras flashing as Karoline appeared at the top of the courthouse steps. She held her ground. A voice from the crowd shouted, "Karoline, what do you say to people who think this was all staged for publicity?" She didn't hesitate. "I say, they weren't in that room." Another question followed. "Do you think Marks was targeting you because of your politics?" Karoline paused. "I think he was targeting anyone who challenged the control he thought he had today. I happened to be the one standing in his way." A flurry of shutters clicked in sync. Some reporters nodded, others just kept recording. Back in the courthouse, the investigation was already in motion. Seized hard drives, boxes of files, a forensic audit team beginning its slow crawl through years of rulings. News vans began broadcasting live coverage, filling in the gaps with speculation. The headlines varied: "Judge arrested in shocking courtroom twist." "Karoline Leavitt holds her ground." "Judge let out in handcuffs." "Public humiliation turns politics." "Courtroom drama goes viral." Social media exploded. Clips from the hearing were everywhere. Some framed Karoline as the target of a deep-rooted political machine. Others accused her of playing the victim. The country, as always, split down the middle. But in one suburban home in Nashua, a retired court reporter named Martin Finn sat watching the footage on his tablet. He had covered Marks in the early years, back when the judge had a reputation for being sharp, measured, and fair. What he saw now was a man who'd been consumed by his own sense of control. Power had a way of warping even the brightest minds. He turned to his wife and said, she didn't flinch. The girl didn't flinch once. But what Martin didn't know, and what Karoline kept buried under every calm sentence, was that her hands had been shaking behind that podium, not from fear, from anger, from frustration, from the sting of having to stand perfectly still while someone tried to erase years of her work with a few smug comments. But she also knew this wasn't the end. It was just the opening act of something bigger and harder, and far more public. The next 48 hours didn't slow down. If anything, they escalated. Every major news outlet carried the footage: a sitting judge arrested mid-hearing, indicted in front of cameras, while a young political figure stood stoic and unwavering. It was television gold. The internet ran wild with theories, edits, hashtags. One clip of Karoline's calm line, "So this hearing is about sending a message," got over 4 million views in a day. Some saw her as the symbol of resilience. Others accused her of orchestrating the whole thing. The truth, as usual, sat somewhere in between. But most people didn't care about that. They wanted a narrative. They wanted a side to pick. At home, Karoline stayed mostly offline. She wasn't hiding, just watching, listening, processing. That night, she sat at her mother's kitchen table, and Hook set a hot mug of tea untouched in front of her. The TV was on low volume. Her mother, Marlene, sat across from her, knitting slowly. "You handled yourself well, Marlene said, not looking up. Karoline offered a tired smile. I almost lost it. But you didn't. Silence stretched between them for a few seconds, then Marlene added, he didn't think you'd stand there and take it. He expected a meltdown, something he could point to later and say, see, she's just another emotional kid. Karoline nodded slowly. I thought about walking out, just standing up and leaving. Why didn't you? She looked down at the mug. Because if I had, it would have made it easier for him to rewrite the whole moment. Her mother didn't respond. She didn't need to. Meanwhile, the legal world was buzzing. The Judicial Conduct Committee released a short but direct statement confirming the investigation, and the Marks had been underway for months. They'd received multiple complaints, some recent, some buried deep. The final push had come from Jillian Vargas, whose identity was now public, and whose bravery sparked a nationwide conversation about accountability within the judiciary. A guest panel on a national broadcast featured 3 legal analysts, each trying to explain what had gone wrong. Marks had too much autonomy for too long. One said he got used to not being questioned. Another chimed in, it's not about politics, it's about power. He went unchecked, and it eroded his sense of balance. Back in Manchester, courthouse staff were trying to pick up the pieces. Every case Marks had touched in the last 2 years was under review. Some rulings might be overturned, others retried. It was a mess, a necessary one, maybe, but a mess all the same. And in Karoline's inbox, the messages poured in: supporters, detractors, media invitations, speaking requests, people telling her she was brave or reckless, or both. Her name was now everywhere, whether she wanted it or not. One email caught her eye. It was from Jillian. Subject: you shouldn't have had to go through that, body, but I'm glad you did. Not for you, but for the rest of us who were scared to say something. Karoline replied within minutes, you weren't the one who stayed silent, you were the one who saved the room. Still, not everyone was happy. Late-night commentators accused her of benefiting from the drama. Political rivals suggested the entire event had been manufactured to gain sympathy and exposure. One even went as far as calling it a theater stunt wrapped in legal drama. But the footage told a different story. You couldn't fake the surprise on Marks's face. You couldn't rehearse the timing of federal agents stepping in as he raised his voice. You couldn't manufacture the silence that followed. And yet, but as the noise grew louder, Karoline knew she had to make a choice: stay reactive or take control of what came next. 3 weeks later, Karoline sat in a model studio chair across from veteran journalist Colleen Draper at a local station in Concord. It wasn't a primetime network interview. She turned all those down. Too much spectacle, too many pre-approved talking points. This one was quiet, respectful, something she could sit through without feeling like a puppet on a string. The lights came up, cameras rolled. Colleen adjusted her glasses. Karoline, thank you for being here. Thanks for having me. Let's start with a question everyone's asking. When you walked into that courtroom, did you know something bigger was about to happen? Karoline didn't smile. She didn't lean into the theatrics. She just answered plainly, no, I knew the complaint was weak. I expected a few cheap shots, maybe some media bait, but I didn't know federal agents were waiting in the hallway. Colleen nodded. When Judge Mark started getting personal, bringing up your background, your faith, your upbringing, what was going through your mind, I wanted to leave. Karoline said, her tone firm, but I also knew if I left it would be framed as me backing down. That hearing wasn't about the facts, it was about power. And the one thing I learned fast in politics is if you give bullies the last word, they'll rewrite the whole chapter. Colleen sat back slightly, letting the silence carry the weight of that line. Do you think what happened with Marks was personal or political? Both. Personal in the way he tried to dismantle my character, political in the way he used the courtroom like a stage. He wasn't just trying to embarrass me, he wanted to send a message to anyone who sounded like me, looked like me, or challenged him across the country. The fallout was still being felt. The Judicial Ethics Board had already suspended several of Marks's past rulings. A formal committee had been established in New Hampshire to review the process of investigating judicial complaints. It wasn't fast, but it was real. Something was moving. Karoline hadn't made any big speeches, no press conference, no viral videos. She let others speculate. Her focus was somewhere else. Colleen leaned forward. You've stayed relatively quiet since that day. Why? Karoline hesitated. Because I didn't want to turn this into a brand. I didn't want to sell coffee mugs with my face on them, or run ads pretending I survived something no one else could have handled. I stayed quiet because I was angry, and I didn't want to speak from anger. Colleen raised an eyebrow. What would you say now? Looking back, Karoline breathed, and I'd say power without accountability is dangerous, and sometimes the only thing that exposes it is standing still and refusing to flinch. The interview ended with a handshake, and as the lights dimmed, Karoline finally let her shoulders drop. Backstage, her phone buzzed. A message from Alan. You did good, simple, honest, exactly what it needed to be. That night, she drove back to her apartment just outside Bedford. The roads were mostly empty, no paparazzi, no protesters, just a quiet return to something that felt like normal. At a red light, she thought about Jillian, about how one scared assistant had tipped over an entire system because she chose to speak when silence was safer, about how justice didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it came in through a side door while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. She didn't feel heroic, she felt aware, and that awareness was the lesson she hoped people would carry from the chaos, that speaking the truth doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks awkward, shaky, uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels like losing, but it still matters, because sometimes all it takes to shift the balance is one person who refuses to play along. So, if you've ever been in a room where someone tried to shrink you, silence you, or humiliate you, remember this: your silence isn't safety, and your voice, even shaking, can be the thing that changes everything. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it, and make sure you subscribe. You never know who might need to hear it next.